Hello everyone and welcome to Executive Bourbon Club. I am your host as always. My name is Rick. It's good to have you here. We film this every month, and for those of you who may not know, if you haven't seen us before, Executive Bourbon Club refers to two things. One, we are a club that executives come to. We hang out at this really cool bourbon bar in beautiful downtown Greenville, South Carolina on Main Street, and it is called Neat Bourbon Bar. Now you're going to see folks going back and forth in front of the camera a little bit. We got a lot of folks that are around here, so don't worry about that. Bartenders may be going back and forth behind me as well. Don't worry about that. I think you'll be able to hear me okay. Usually I am joined by my good buddy Tommy Moran. Tommy runs this joint, but Tommy is feeling ill today. He's not going to be able to be with me, and so I'm going to soldier on by myself. Today we're going to be talking about 3 feature bourbons. Actually, we're going to talk about 4, but 3 of them are feature. One of them is just a little bit of an oddity. And I'll explain that to you here in a minute. But at the end of all of these episodes, our executives that again get together every month to spend a little time, have a bourbon, have some sips, and just hang out with each other. When this is over, when the episode is over, they're going to be able to crack open these feature bourbons that we're getting ready to talk about. Now, the first one that is on the agenda tonight is Bernheim Original. Now, Bernheim comes from the Heaven Hill Distillery, okay? Now, this is a brand out of Heaven Hill that a lot of folks don't know much about. It has only recently become popular. Now, Bernheim, this is a wheated whiskey, and this is the first time they've put out this Bernheim wheated whiskey barrel proof. It came out earlier this year. Now, the reason that I have included this on the show today, and I'm sipping a little Bernheim right now, is because Bernheim just won an award. It was just recognized as part of Whiskey Advocate's Top 10 Whiskeys of the Year. So I'm going to take a sec and take a sip. Bernheim. This is called a wheated whiskey, not to be confused with a wheated bourbon. The difference is this. Some of you, of course, already know this, but a wheated bourbon is still going to be at least 51% corn, which is required by law if you're going to call yourself a bourbon. But a wheated bourbon will still be 51% minimum, but then, of course, the grain that is primary after the corn is wheat. However, in this wheated whiskey, the primary grain is not corn, it's actually wheat. And the mash bill on this is 51% wheat, and I'm going to have to look at this because I don't recall. It's 51% wheat, 37% corn, and 12% malted barley. I read better without my glasses, go figure. Now, let me give you the tail of the tape on this, okay? 122.6 proof. Now, I have sipped on this a little bit before we came on the show, and I'm sipping on it now. This is a high proof, but it's really not a stinger. It's really not overly hot. It goes down nice and easy. It's pretty smooth. I like it. Being the fact that it has so much wheat in it, it's of course going to taste sweet, as opposed to a bourbon, a traditional bourbon that is going to have more rye in it than wheat, which is going to lend a more spicy, peppery taste. So this, being 51% wheat, is sweet. And you can definitely taste it. It kind of tastes a little like fresh bread, right? Which makes sense. $75 on the MSRP with this. Not bad at all. I think $65 is the actual suggested, but I had to pay an extra $10 for it because it's starting to get a little bit rare. This is aged 7 to 9 years, blended barrels. Anyway, this good stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about Heaven Hill Distillery for a second. Now, Heaven Hill has a lot of bourbon brands that you're definitely aware of. If you're not familiar with Heaven Hill, then you're probably familiar with the brands they produce, such as Elijah Craig, Evan Williams, and Old Fitzgerald, and there are others as well. But what Heaven Hill is best known for, just talking about the bourbon brand itself, is the Grain to Glass series that they started a few years back, and it is outstanding. If you want to check that out, I think we did that on episode 1. Anyway, really good stuff. I would recommend Bernheim Original Kentucky Straight Wheat Whiskey. Next up, Charles Goodnight. Now, I had not heard of this bourbon before I'm going to say 8 months ago, okay? And we're recording this in December of 2024. So I first heard of Charles Goodnight, I'm going to guess about 8 months ago. This is not a bourbon that a lot of people are really familiar with just yet. And it's really interesting. Charles Goodnight is a bourbon that is distilled out of Texas. And the reason that I have made this a feature pick tonight and that we're talking about it is because it just won a huge award. It was just named, and I want to make sure I get this right, okay? It was just named the best straight bourbon of the year at the 2024 London Spirits Competition. Now that London competition, that's a pretty good one. There are several in Europe that are well known. There's about 40 tasters that go to that. The fact that they chose this is just interesting to me, and if you taste it, you'll understand what I'm talking about. I'm just going to call it funky, okay? It is a little funky on the palate. Now, what the heck does that mean? I don't really know what to tell you. It just tastes, it smells and tastes different than I think any bourbon that I have ever tasted myself. It tastes a little like chocolate. Of course, just like all bourbons, there's a little caramel there, but it tastes like dark chocolate, and you can really smell it on the nose. It's really interesting. It was released last year in 2023, but it made the award circuit beginning this year, okay? The mash bill, I want to make sure I get it right. The mash bill is 60% corn, 36% rye, and 4% malted barley. It's aged 6 years. Okay, so who is this guy, Charles Goodnight? So apparently Charles Goodnight was a cattleman in Texas a long time ago, early 1900s, something like that. Now, Charles Goodnight's great nephew is a guy named Foley. I forget Foley's first name, all right? Doesn't matter. Foley owns the Las Vegas NHL hockey team that just won the Stanley Cup last year. So Foley founded the NHL hockey team, the Golden Knights. Yes, the Las Vegas Golden Knights 6 years ago. The interesting thing is that this bourbon was aged 6 years and just came out. So I'm assuming that when this bourbon went into the barrel was the same time that Mr. Foley was buying the Las Vegas NHL hockey team. And now they have won the Stanley Cup, and now his bourbon has also won this huge award. Is it worth the award? I don't know. I love the look of the bottle though. It's got this raised steer on the front. Looks really cool. I'm sure the folks in Austin, Texas, looks like a Texas Longhorn. Looks cool. But Foley also owns a number of wineries that are spread throughout the country. It's okay, buddy. Come right on. It doesn't matter. Adds to the character. Hang out right there. I'll be with you. Okay, so that's Charles Goodnight. I would give it a shot. It is, let me make sure I tell you exactly what the right price is. MSRP $80, which I think I paid $85 for it. But you can still find this a little bit everywhere. Interesting bourbon, give it a shot. All right, next up is Larceny Barrel Proof. Now, Larceny has only been coming out for about 12 years. This, of course, is another Heaven Hill product, like we just talked a minute ago. The Bernheim Original, as I break my bottles, the Bernheim Original, a Heaven Hill product. Larceny, a Heaven Hill product. We started putting Larceny out about 12 years ago. The barrel proof Larceny, and it is hot, but it doesn't go, it's hot, 124.2 proof, but it doesn't go down that hot. It's actually pretty smooth. You don't even need a rock or two to cool this one off. It's a high proof, but it doesn't taste like a high proof. That's really interesting. But this also won an award. All three bourbons that we're letting our executives taste tonight won an award, and this one was named the world champion in the bourbon category at the American Distilling Institute's International Spirits Competition earlier this year. That's a mouthful. I want to make sure that I get the mash bill right for you. 68% corn, 20% wheat, so that's probably why it goes down a little smoother, because it is not rye forward. It is a wheat bourbon, 20% wheat, 12% malted barley. All right, one more thing about this bottle. If you look on a Larceny label, I find this interesting. It says John E. Fitzgerald. John Fitzgerald is the Fitzgerald of the Old Fitzgerald brand, okay? If you know anything about bourbon, you're well aware of Old Fitzgerald. Old Fitzgerald has been out for many, many years. It is one of the longest, the most well-established brands, in addition to probably Elijah Craig, in the stable of bourbons at Heaven Hill. John Fitzgerald is also on the Larceny label. Now, why is that? It's just really small right above Larceny. So here's the story. So John Fitzgerald was a United States Treasury agent way back in the late 1800s. And the story goes that it was John's job to go into the warehouses and check and make sure, kind of audit the barrels, right? Make sure, on behalf of Uncle Sam, that the bourbon distillers were not producing more bourbon than they said they were, so that they can get taxed appropriately by Uncle Sam, right? So John Fitzgerald, as the story goes into the bourbon distilleries in the middle of the night, kind of, snoops around, does his thing. He's a treasury agent, right? That's what they do, I suppose. He goes in there, he's got his flashlight, he's doing things, no worries. He's doing his stuff, right? And so apparently John loves his bourbon. And so he's there in the middle of the night. He's got the keys to the warehouses. He knows where his favorite bourbons are. He goes around. He finds a bourbon that looks good to him or a barrel that looks good. He pops it open. He tastes it. He tastes this. He tastes that. And he finds the one that he likes. So what does he do? He fills up some jugs. He takes them home. I don't know what he does with them. He sells them. He lets his buddy have them or whatever. But whatever he does is apparently enough that when the time comes for them to take the bourbon barrels and move them, rotate them around the rick house, that they can tell the bourbon barrels that don't weigh as much as some of the other bourbon barrels. Now, let's break right there for a second. In a distillery, you're going to rotate, and they did this a lot more back in the day than they might necessarily do now. The warehouse that you store a bourbon in is called a rick house, right? Bourbon barrels, sometimes they may sit here on the third floor in front of an east-facing window, and then 6 months later they rotate those barrels to maybe a second floor west-facing window, and then maybe sometimes they put them in the basement where there's no sun at all, and then over the course of 6 or 8 years, what do you know, the bourbon comes out and it has a distinctive palate based on all that. So what that means is that every X number of months, they're rotating these barrels around. Okay, so now back to the story. John Fitzgerald, he's been in there, he's been doing his thing, right? He's been stealing bourbon, he's been, stealing a little here, stealing a little there, putting them in jugs, taking them out, so much so that his favorite barrels were noticeably lighter. The folks, they realized who was doing it after a while, and those became known as the Old Fitzgerald bottles. Why is this barrel so much lighter than the other barrels? That's because Old man Fitzgerald came in here, found the bourbon he liked. This is the bourbon he liked, and that's where the Old Fitzgerald bourbon was born. So Larceny, the name Larceny, is kind of a spin-off of the Old Fitzgerald bourbon in the fact that, hey, old man Fitzgerald was stealing bourbon, and hence the name John Fitzgerald on the bottle for Larceny. Okay, folks, the only other thing that I want to share with you tonight is a bourbon that I don't know if this is any good or not, but it's an interesting marketing ploy, one that I kind of fell for a few weeks ago. I was looking at the shelves, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. This may be the worst bourbon ever, but the marketing ploy got me. It is billed as a double single barrel, a 4-grain double single barrel. I never heard of it marketed that way. Now, logically, it makes sense, right? There's a single barrel that is rye heavy. There's a single barrel that is wheat heavy. They blended them together. You got 4 grains there. You got the corn, you got the rye, you got the wheat, you got the barley. A single barrel here and a single barrel there. You put them all together and you come up with this edition from Lux Row. It costs $35. It's only 100 proof, so it's not a stinger. I don't know if it's any good or not, but we're all going to find out soon. Okay, folks, that's it. That's another episode of Executive Bourbon Club. We're going to get out of here and get back into the back where our executives are so we can taste some bourbon. Appreciate you joining. We'll see you next time.